Hey there. Welcome back to our series on how the courts decide what happens when someone breaks the law. In this video, we're going to talk about what it means when someone is sent to prison. Yep, we're diving into custodial sentences. We'll look at different types of sentences, why they exist, and we'll break it all down with examples that make it easy to understand. So, what exactly is a custodial sentence? It's when a court decides that the best way to deal with someone who's committed a crime is to send them to prison. There are a few different kinds of custodial sentences, and the laws that guide these decisions include the Criminal Justice Act 2003, the Sentencing Act 2020, and a few others. Let's start with the big one: mandatory life sentences. If someone is found guilty of murder, the law says they must get a life sentence. But don't get confused. This doesn't always mean they'll spend their entire life in prison. The judge will set a minimum term, or tariff, which is the shortest time they must stay in prison before they can even think about getting out. For example, imagine a really serious crime like a brutal murder. The judge might say the offender has to serve at least 25 years in prison before they can be considered for release. And even then, they don't get out automatically. They have to prove they're no longer a danger to anyone. In the most extreme cases, the judge might decide on a whole life sentence, which means the offender will never be released. This happens when the crime is so severe that the person is considered too dangerous to ever be let out. Oh, and here's something interesting. Under Section 122 of the LASPO Act 2012, if someone is convicted of a second serious offense, the court must impose a life sentence unless it would be unjust to do so. So, if someone messes up big time twice, they're almost certainly looking at life behind bars. Next up are discretionary life sentences. Unlike mandatory life sentences, these aren't automatic, but can be given for really serious crimes, like armed robbery or a serious assault. The judge looks at how bad the crime was and how dangerous the person is. The idea is to protect the public while making sure the punishment fits the crime. For instance, if someone commits a violent robbery, the judge might give them a life sentence, especially if they've hurt someone badly or have a history of doing this kind of thing. Now, let's talk about extended determinate sentences, or EDS for short. These sentences were introduced by the LASPO Act 2012. They're a bit different. They're longer than regular sentences because they include extra time on license after the person is released. This extra time is there to protect the public and make sure the person is really ready to be out in the community again. Let's say someone gets an EDS of 9 years. They might spend 6 years in prison and then, if they're doing well, they could be released after 2/3 of that time, so after 4 years. But they're not off the hook. They'll be on license for the rest of their sentence and for an extra 3 years, where they have to follow strict rules to stay out of trouble. Some crimes are so serious that if you keep committing them, the law says you have to serve a minimum amount of time in prison. This is called a minimum sentence, and it's set out in sections 313 to 315 of the Sentencing Act 2020. If you're caught trafficking Class A drugs, like heroin or cocaine, for the third time, you're looking at a minimum of 7 years in prison. If you're caught burgling someone's home for the third time, the minimum is 3 years. And if you're repeatedly caught with a weapon, like a knife, you'll face a minimum sentence too. But here's the thing, these minimum sentences are usually set unless the judge finds something really exceptional that makes them think the minimum isn't fair. The Police, Crime, Sentencing and Courts Act 2022 made this even tougher by saying that the judge has to find exceptional circumstances to avoid giving the minimum sentence, not just particular circumstances. This means it's now harder for someone to get a shorter sentence if they're a repeat offender. Most people who go to prison serve what's called a determinate sentence. This means there's a set amount of time they'll spend in prison, like 4 years. They usually spend half of that time in prison and the other half in the community on license, which means they have to follow certain rules to stay out. The Criminal Justice Act 2003 sets out how these sentences work. For example, if someone is sentenced to 4 years for a serious fight, they might spend 2 years in prison and then 2 years on license. But if they break the rules while on license, they could be sent back to prison to finish their sentence. Now, let's talk about suspended sentences. Under Section 189 of the Criminal Justice Act 2003, a suspended sentence is when a judge gives someone a prison sentence but delays it, meaning the offender doesn't go to prison right away. Instead, they get a chance to stay out of prison as long as they don't break the law again and follow any other rules the judge gives them. For example, if someone gets a 12-month suspended sentence, they might have to do community service or go to rehab. But if they mess up, like if they commit another crime, they'll have to serve that 12 months in prison, plus whatever sentence they get for the new crime. Home Detention Curfew, or HDC, is another way some people can finish their sentence outside of prison. It's often called tagging because the person has to wear an electronic tag that tracks where they are. They have to stay at a specific address, usually home, for a certain amount of time each day, like from 7 p.m. to 7 a.m. Not everyone can get HDC. According to the HDC policy framework, if you've committed a serious crime, like a violent offense or something involving weapons, you won't be eligible. But if you are eligible and you follow the rules, you might get out of prison earlier than planned. For example, someone serving 18 months in prison might be released on HDC after 9 months, but they have to stick to the curfew and any other rules. If they break the rules, they can be sent back to prison. And that's a wrap on adult custodial sentences. We've talked about everything from life sentences to home detention curfews, and hopefully, you've got a clearer idea of how these work. Remember, these sentences aren't just about punishment. They're also about protecting the public and helping people turn their lives around. Let's quickly recap the key points we've covered about custodial sentences in the UK. Number 1. Mandatory life sentences. These are imposed for murder. The judge sets a minimum term, or tariff, that the offender must serve. In the most extreme cases, a whole life sentence may be given, meaning the offender will never be released. Number 2. Discretionary life sentences. These can be given for serious crimes like armed robbery. The judge has the discretion to decide based on how severe the crime is and how dangerous the offender is to the public. Number 3. Extended Determinate Sentences, EDS, introduced by the LASPO Act 2012. These are longer sentences that include additional time on license after the offender is released. This extra time is meant to protect the public. Number 4. Minimum sentences for repeat offenders. For certain repeat offenses, the law mandates minimum sentences. For example, a third drug trafficking offense involving Class A drugs carries a minimum of 7 years in prison, as outlined in the Sentencing Act 2020. Number 5. Fixed-term, determinate sentences. These are sentences with a set period of time in prison, followed by a period on license in the community, as per the Criminal Justice Act 2003. Number 6. Suspended sentences. These are prison sentences that are delayed. The offender doesn't go to prison immediately and can stay out as long as they comply with certain conditions set by the judge. And finally, number 7, Home Detention Curfew. HDC. This is an early release scheme where the offender is released with an electronic tag and a curfew. Only those who meet strict eligibility criteria can benefit from HDC. We have also looked at the key legislation that shapes how custodial sentences are handed out in the UK. Criminal Justice Act 2003. This act provides the framework for various custodial sentences, including fixed-term, determinate sentences, suspended sentences, and discretionary life sentences. Sentencing Act 2020. This act sets out the minimum sentences for specific repeat offenses, such as drug trafficking and burglary. Legal aid, sentencing and punishment of offenders, LASPO, Act 2012. This act introduced extended determinate sentences, EDS, and mandates life sentences for second serious offenses under Section 122. Police, Crime, Sentencing and Courts Act 2022. This act amended the threshold for avoiding mandatory minimum sentences, requiring exceptional rather than particular circumstances for judges to deviate from these minimums. Thank you for listening to this Law Bank video. Remember, this could be assessed as an 8-mark question. Now, in our next video, we'll be looking at non-custodial sentences for adults.